That morning began with the kind of silence that felt too heavy for air. No birds, no passing cars, only the ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound that seemed to mock the stillness inside me. My husband of 45 years, George Henderson, had passed away just a few hours earlier. The paramedics had left. The neighbors had whispered their condolences and vanished. The house, once full of laughter and life, now looked like a museum of memories I could no longer bear to touch. I sat in his old recliner, still warm where he had slept most nights during his illness. The scent of his aftershave clung to the fabric. I held the cup of coffee he'd never finish and stared at the photo above the fireplace, our wedding picture. I was 19 then, awkward, shy, and completely certain that George was the best man I would ever know. Even now, with grief clawing through my chest, that belief hadn't changed. The front door opened. I expected it to be the funeral director or maybe the pastor. Instead, I heard the sharp, hurried voice of my daughter-in-law, Clara. "Finally," she muttered, her heels striking the floor like tiny hammers. "This place smells like medicine and death." I didn't turn around. My heart, already raw, clenched tighter. Clara had been in my house fewer times than the mailman. Since marrying my son Andrew, she had treated me as though I were an inconvenient piece of old furniture. But today of all days, I expected at least a little compassion. She walked straight into the living room and stood in front of me, her arms crossed. "I called Andrew. He's on his way," she said flatly. "The lawyer said there's going to be a lot to sort out, so we might as well start clearing things." I blinked. "Clearing things? Clara, your father-in-law just passed away." "Don't you think?" she interrupted. "Exactly. Which means this house will need to be evaluated for probate. The sooner we get organized, the sooner we can move on." Move on. 2 words that felt like a slap. I watched her pull on a pair of latex gloves and begin opening drawers, stacking photo frames, tossing medicine bottles into a trash bag. My hands shook. I wanted to stop her, but my voice came out thin and useless. When Andrew arrived an hour later, his face pale and grief-stricken, I thought he would stop her. Instead, he hugged me quickly, avoiding my eyes. "Mom, Clara's just trying to help. It's easier if we start today." Easier for whom? I went upstairs to the bedroom to gather George's watch and the letter he had left for the lawyer. When I came down again, I saw Clara dragging my suitcases from the hallway closet. She had stacked them by the back door, beside boxes labeled kitchen, donate and books, trash. "What are you doing with those?" I asked. She looked at me without flinching. "There's not enough room here once the estate is processed. You'll be more comfortable in the guest house, at least until we figure out what to do with the property." The guest house. A converted garage with 1 window and a leaking roof. My husband's tools still hung on the wall out there, rusting in silence. I felt heat rush to my face. "I live here, Clara," I said, my voice trembling. "This is my home." "Technically," she replied, adjusting her designer scarf, "it was George's. Once the paperwork is done, we'll see what belongs to whom. Until then, please cooperate. I'm not trying to be cruel, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills." Andrew murmured something about needing to handle things professionally. I looked at my son, the same boy I had carried through storms and sickness, the boy who once promised to take care of me, and realized he wasn't going to defend me. So I did the only thing left. I walked quietly to my room, packed what I could, some clothes, a box of photos, and George's old leather briefcase, and stepped outside. The sky had turned gray. Rain clouds gathered over the hills. Clara followed, carrying another box. "Here," she said, shoving it toward me. "More of your things. I'll have someone bring the rest later." When the box hit the ground, its lid flew open. Papers scattered, fluttering across the wet driveway, receipts, letters, and an envelope George had sealed just 2 weeks ago. Clara didn't notice. She had already turned away. I knelt to gather the papers. That's when I saw it. The envelope was thicker than I remembered. Heavy, its edges marked with George's precise handwriting. "For Margaret, open only after my passing." I held it close to my chest, my heart pounding. Clara called out from the doorway, "Make sure you don't leave a mess in the garage." Then she slammed the door. Inside the dim, cold garage, I placed the suitcase on the old workbench and sat down on a stool. I was shaking, not just from grief, but from something deeper, an unease that whispered there was more to George's calm last smile than I'd realized. The briefcase clicked open easily. Inside were neatly organized folders labeled Accounts, Properties, Correspondence. Beneath them lay another sealed envelope marked Private, to be given to Margaret only. 2 envelopes, both in his handwriting, both waiting for me. My hands trembled as I opened the first. Inside was a short note and a small brass key taped to the paper. My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, then I'm gone. Don't let grief make you small. There's something in the old cedar chest that we never spoke about. Keep it safe and don't trust appearances. What you find there will explain everything. Love, George. I froze. The cedar chest, our wedding gift, the one that sat at the foot of our bed. Clara had moved it earlier that morning, muttering about junk furniture. I pictured it now, probably shoved into some corner of the garage behind boxes of unwanted memories. I found it within minutes, dusty and scratched. The lock was still intact. I inserted the tiny key. It turned with a faint click. Inside, beneath a layer of old quilts, was a thick folder and a velvet pouch. I opened the folder first. Bank statements, investment documents, and property deeds. Dozens of them, all under George's name, all listing me as joint owner. My breath caught as I saw the total figures. Over $19 million. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The velvet pouch held a small USB drive and another handwritten note. This is our legacy, Maggie. I kept it quiet so no one could take it from you. If Andrew ever loses himself, remind him who he was. If Clara ever shows her true colors, don't waste a tear. Everything you need to rebuild your life is in this chest. Tears spilled down my cheeks, mixing with the dust on my hands. In that silent garage, I felt George's presence stronger than ever, steady, protective, wise. Outside, I heard Clara laughing on the phone. Yes, Mom, she's in the garage. Probably crying or something. We'll deal with her later. I looked at the chest again, the papers glinting faintly under the single hanging bulb. George hadn't just left me memories. He'd left me power. And something in me, something that had been crushed under years of politeness, started to wake up. I spent the rest of that evening sitting on the cold garage floor, surrounded by dusty boxes and the faint scent of motor oil. The rain outside turned into a steady rhythm, tapping softly on the tin roof like a metronome marking time for my new life to begin. My fingers still trembled as I held the folder filled with bank papers. $19 million. It was an impossible number, one that didn't fit inside the world Clara had tried to shove me into. I reread George's note several times. His words weren't just comforting. They were deliberate, like instructions for a storm he had seen coming. If Clara ever shows her true colors, don't waste a tear. I wiped my eyes and whispered into the silence. Oh, George. You always saw things before I did. The door to the garage creaked open suddenly. Clara's voice sliced through the air. Are you planning to stay out here all night? I don't want you tracking dirt into the house tomorrow. I folded the papers quickly, sliding the envelope into the inside pocket of my cardigan. Don't worry, Clara. You won't have to clean up after me. She smirked, leaning against the doorframe. You really think you're staying here much longer? Once the lawyer reads the will, things are going to change. Don't get too comfortable. The confidence in her voice was sharp, venomous. She thought she was already the queen of this house. I only smiled faintly and said, You're right. Everything is about to change. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I made myself a small pot of tea and wrote down every single thing George had left. The USB drive, the papers, the key. Then, using my old phone, I looked up the contact number for Mr. Hughes, our family attorney. He had handled George's affairs for over 20 years. When he picked up, his voice was gentle. Mrs. Henderson, I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, Robert, I said, my voice steady. I believe my husband left some instructions for me in private. Could we meet before the official will reading? There was a pause on the other end. Ah, yes. I was wondering when you'd call. He did leave something personal for you. I can meet you this afternoon if that works. That would be perfect. I ended the call, feeling a weight lift slightly off my chest. Clara could throw my clothes and mutter about bills all she wanted. She had no idea that her mother-in-law was quietly holding the very thing she was waiting to steal. By the time Andrew woke up, the house smelled of bacon and coffee. He looked worn out, like a man pulled between guilt and loyalty. "Mom, Clara said you slept out there." "Why didn't you come inside?" I smiled. "Because sometimes it's better to be surrounded by memories than people who've forgotten how to be kind." He frowned. "Please don't start." I didn't. I only poured him a cup of coffee and slid a plate toward him. "We'll talk after the will reading, Andrew." Clara entered the kitchen in a silk robe, her hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour.
"Morning."
"We should probably leave soon, right? I want to make sure the lawyer knows we're serious about the estate." "Of course," I said quietly, slipping my handbag over my shoulder. "I'll meet you there." She raised an eyebrow. "You're going separately?" "Yes," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "I have a few errands first." Her lips twitched into a smirk, but she said nothing. Mr. Hughes's office was warm and lined with books, a comforting change after the frost in my own house. He greeted me with genuine kindness, then handed me a sealed envelope. "Your husband prepared this 2 months ago," he said softly. "He insisted it be opened only by you." Inside was a letter and a single line written in George's bold handwriting. "When the truth comes out, keep your head high. I made sure you will have the last word." Attached beneath it was a printed document, an official letter to Mr. Hughes himself. It detailed a separate trust, independent of the public will, transferring all personal accounts and real estate holdings amounting to over $19 million directly to me. It was airtight, witnessed, notarized, and legally sound. Tears welled up in my eyes. "He really thought of everything," I whispered. Mr. Hughes nodded. "He was very clear, Mrs. Henderson. He said, 'My wife has endured too much silence. When I'm gone, I want her to be the one who decides what happens next.'" I clutched the papers, feeling both overwhelmed and steadier than I had in years. By noon, we were all seated in Mr. Hughes's conference room. Clara had dressed like she was attending an award ceremony, in a sharp navy dress and diamond earrings. She was already tapping on her phone when the lawyer entered. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We're here to review the last will and testament of Mr. George Henderson." Clara leaned forward eagerly. "Let's get to it." Mr. Hughes cleared his throat. "As per Mr. Henderson's wishes, his assets are divided into 2 parts, business properties and personal estate. The business accounts, totaling $200,000, will go to his son, Andrew Henderson." Andrew nodded quietly. "And the personal residence, along with all attached valuables and remaining funds." Clara's lips parted in anticipation. "Will be transferred entirely to Mrs. Margaret Henderson, his wife." The air left the room. Clara blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Mr. Hughes repeated, slower this time. "The house, vehicles, and personal accounts are to remain under Mrs. Henderson's ownership. Mr. Henderson's clear instruction was that she retain complete control over his estate." Clara's smile faltered. "That can't be right. He told Andrew that—" Andrew interrupted softly. "Clara, stop." She turned to him, stunned. "Stop? You know how much work I've done here." "The bills, the medical," I finally spoke, my voice calm. "George paid every hospital bill himself. I have the receipts." Clara glared at me, her voice shaking. "You're lying. You're manipulating this." Mr. Hughes handed her a copy of the notarized document. "It's all here, Mrs. Henderson. Your father-in-law's signature, verified and witnessed." Clara stared at the papers, her face draining of color. For the first time, she looked small, like a child caught in a lie too big to fix. Andrew rubbed his temples. "Clara, please, let's just go home," but she couldn't stop. "No, this isn't fair. He didn't even like living here toward the end. He wanted everything sold." I looked at her gently. Maybe he didn't like how the people in the house behaved. Silence fell. Even Mr. Hughes hesitated before clearing his throat. "There's one final clause. Mr. Henderson instructed that the garage currently used for storage remain untouched until further notice." Clara frowned. "The garage? Why would he care about that old place?" I smiled faintly, tucking my folder closer. "Because sometimes, Clara, the things we throw away hold the most value." Her eyes narrowed. She didn't understand, not yet, but she would. That night, the storm returned. The house groaned under the weight of rain, and lightning cast quick white flashes across the windows, like a camera capturing evidence of every secret this home had tried to hide. I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed with George's folder open on my lap, rereading every line of the trust letter. It wasn't just money, it was protection. It was the shield my husband had left me against the wolves disguised as family. Down the hall, I could hear Clara's sharp footsteps, pacing. Her voice broke the stillness. "Andrew, we have to contest it. She manipulated him. She must have." Andrew's voice was low, tired. "Clara, please, enough. I saw the papers. Dad signed everything fair and clear. You're seriously going to let her keep everything?" She snapped. "I'm going to let my father's wishes stand," he said firmly. There was a long silence. Then I heard her slam the bedroom door. I smiled faintly, whispering to the shadows, "She won't sleep tonight." The next morning, I woke to find the kitchen spotless, Clara's way of pretending she was still in control. But her eyes were hollow, rimmed with red. "Good morning," I said, pouring tea. She ignored me. "I'll be out for a while." "Don't wait up," Andrew looked between us. "Where are you going?" "Errands," she muttered and grabbed her purse. But I already knew where she was going. 2 hours later, I parked my old sedan down the street across from my own house. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I watched as Clara, in her bright red coat, slipped into the garage. Her movements were frantic, jerky. She pulled at boxes, ripped open bags, and rummaged through George's old tool drawers. She thought I didn't know about the hidden compartment. George had built that workbench with his own hands, and beneath the second drawer, he had left a secret panel, a hollow lined with cedar to keep the contents dry. Inside it, I had found not only the bank papers, but also a black velvet pouch. Inside that pouch was a USB drive labeled simply, "Insurance." She had no idea what that word meant. I watched as she tossed boxes aside, her hair sticking to her forehead with sweat. At one point, she kicked over a crate of George's tools, screaming. Then she froze. Her eyes caught the drawer. She yanked it open and ran her fingers underneath, searching. I could almost hear George's voice in my head, amused. "Let her look, Maggie. Greed always digs its own grave." When she finally emerged from the garage, covered in dust, she looked furious and defeated. I waited until she drove off, probably to a cafe to complain to her friends about her evil mother-in-law. Then I returned home quietly. The garage was a disaster. Tools everywhere, ripped boxes, shattered glass. But the secret panel was still intact. I knelt down, touched it, and whispered, "Thank you, George. You knew exactly who she was." Inside, I took out the USB again. I had plugged it into my laptop once before, but never opened the files. Maybe it was time. In the quiet of my room, the screen glowed softly as I double-clicked the first file. It was a video. The timestamp read 2 months before George's death. My heart tightened. George sat at his desk, looking tired but determined. "If you're watching this, Maggie," he began, "then I suppose Clara has shown her fangs. I've seen the way she looks at you, the way she whispers to Andrew when she thinks I can't hear. But I need you to know something." He leaned closer to the camera. "I've left them nothing they didn't earn. And I've left you everything you deserve. But this drive also contains evidence, proof of Clara's little side business. She's been withdrawing money from Andrew's company accounts for months. I hired a private investigator. You'll find every transaction here." I covered my mouth in shock. George smiled faintly in the video. "I thought about confronting her myself, but I knew you'd handle it better. You always had a quieter kind of strength, Maggie. The kind that wins wars without raising a sword." The screen went dark. I stared at the USB drive in my trembling hands. Clara wasn't just cruel, she was a thief. That night, I printed out the bank records from the USB and placed them neatly in an envelope labeled "For Andrew." The next morning, I found Andrew in the living room, his face buried in his hands. Clara was sitting opposite him, pretending to cry. "I can't believe your mother's doing this to me," she said, her voice trembling. "She's turning you against me." I stepped inside quietly. "No, Clara, you did that yourself." She looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" I placed the envelope on the table between us. "George found out about the transfers. The money you took from Andrew's business. Every cent is documented." Her face went white. What are you talking about?" Andrew snatched the envelope, tearing it open. His eyes moved quickly across the papers, and I saw his expression shift from confusion to disbelief. Then to fury. "Clara," he said, voice shaking. "Tell me this isn't real." She stood up, her voice rising. "She's lying. She forged those." "I recognize the account numbers," he said coldly. "These are our company's records." "My God, Clara, you stole from me." Her mask broke completely. "I did it for us." "You were too busy taking care of your mother to see the business dying." Andrew pushed his chair back. "No, you did it for yourself." She turned to me, her voice filled with venom. "You ruined everything. You old witch." I met her gaze calmly. "No, Clara, you did that when you threw my bags in the garage." She screamed in frustration, grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard that the picture frames rattled on the walls. Andrew sat back down, covering his face. "I didn't want to believe Dad was right about her," he whispered. "But he saw through everyone." I touched his shoulder gently. "He believed in you, Andrew. And now you'll know exactly how to protect what he built." He nodded slowly. "And you, Mom, you protected him even after he was gone." I smiled faintly, though my eyes stung. "That's what love is, darling. Protection that doesn't end with time." Outside, the clouds began to part, and sunlight spilled through the window onto George's old armchair. For the first time since his death, the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt safe. A week later, the envelope I'd given Andrew became the first stone in a landslide. Clara's lawyer contacted him. She was contesting the will. She wanted half of George's estate, claiming that I had manipulated him in his final days to rewrite everything in my favor. The audacity almost made me laugh. George had been sharp until the end, handling his finances better than most young men. But Clara's arrogance knew no limits. The court date was set. I spent the following days gathering paperwork, letters, receipts, every record George and I had ever kept. Andrew was quiet most of the time, guilt eating at him for ever letting Clara into our lives. I didn't blame him. "She fooled all of us, son," I told him one night as we sat over tea. "But you know what your father always said. Truth is patient. It doesn't rush to prove itself." He nodded, but his eyes were distant. "I just wish Dad could see what's happening." I smiled. "Oh, he can. I feel it." When the day of the hearing came, the courthouse smelled of old wood and polish. Clara arrived dressed in black, as though mourning some moral version of herself. Her lawyer was a tall man with slicked hair and a confidence that came from too many wins. I sat quietly beside Andrew, my hands folded, the small USB drive resting in my purse. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, called the session to order. Clara's lawyer started strong, painting her as a grieving widow's victim. "Your Honor," he said, "Mrs. Margaret Robinson exploited her son's death and manipulated a sick, elderly man into signing away millions." The words echoed through the room like poison. I kept my face calm. The judge's gaze turned to me. "Mrs. Robinson, you'll have your chance to respond. For now, let's proceed with evidence." Clara took the stand, crocodile tears already welling. "George trusted me," she said, her voice trembling perfectly. "We were family. But after my husband died, she turned everyone against me. She even accused me of theft when all I ever did was love them." Andrew's fists clenched. I placed my hand over his, whispering, "Let her finish. Truth, remember?" Then came my turn. I stood up, feeling the eyes of the entire room follow me. My voice was steady. "Your Honor, I won't waste your time with long speeches. I'll let my husband speak for himself." I opened my purse, took out the USB, and handed it to the bailiff. This was recorded by my late husband, George Robinson, 2 months before his death. The judge nodded. "Play it." The screen lit up. George appeared, sitting at his desk, his voice calm but firm. "If you're watching this," he said, "then someone is trying to question my will. I want the court to know that I was of sound mind and full awareness when I wrote it. My wife, Margaret, has stood by me for 45 years. Everything I own is hers by right, not by persuasion." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Clara's face went pale, but George wasn't finished. "And to my daughter-in-law, Clara," he continued, his eyes narrowing, "I know about the accounts you drained. I chose not to confront you while I lived because I wanted my son to see your true nature himself. Consider this my farewell gift, the mirror you refused to look into." The video ended. Silence. Even the judge sat frozen for a moment, before leaning back in her chair. "Mrs. Robinson," she said to Clara coldly, "do you wish to continue this claim?" Clara's lawyer stammered, Your Honor, we—" But Clara was already on her feet, her voice trembling with rage. "That recording could be fake. Anyone can make—" "Sit down," the judge snapped. "Unless you have proof of forgery, you'll remain silent." Clara looked around helplessly, realizing that the battle was lost. The judge banged her gavel once. "The court recognizes the validity of the will. Case dismissed." The sound of that gavel was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. Clara stormed out, her heels clattering against the marble floor, muttering curses under her breath. Andrew and I stayed seated, both of us too stunned to move. When we finally stepped outside, the cold air hit my face like freedom itself. Andrew turned to me. "Mom, he really thought of everything, didn't he?" I smiled through the tears that had been threatening to fall. "Yes, son. He knew her better than she knew herself." We drove home in silence, the weight of months finally lifting from our shoulders. When we pulled into the driveway, I looked at the house, the one George had built with his hands, and whispered, "You protected us, love." Even now. That night, Andrew packed Clara's remaining things into boxes. "What should I do with them?" he asked. "Put them in the garage," I said with a wry smile. "That's where she threw my bags, remember? Let her belongings rest where my dignity once did." He chuckled quietly, the first real laugh I'd heard from him in months. "You're tougher than both of us combined, Mom." I smiled, looking toward George's empty chair. I had a good teacher. The next morning, the house smelled of fresh coffee and rain. For the first time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt alive again. The following week, peace seemed to finally settle over the house. For the first time in months, the mornings didn't feel heavy. The air smelled of coffee, the light through the curtains was gentle, and even the clock on the wall seemed to tick slower, as if the whole house was breathing again. But peace, I've learned, never lasts long when greed still walks free. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in the garden, pruning George's roses, the ones he planted for our 20th anniversary, when a sleek black car stopped in front of the gate. My heart tightened the moment I saw the door open. Clara stepped out, wearing dark sunglasses and that same red coat, the one she'd worn the day she rifled through the garage. She wasn't alone. Behind her, a younger man got out, tall, confident, and dressed in a navy suit. He had the kind of smug smile that told you he was paid by the hour to create chaos. "Mrs. Robinson," he said smoothly, walking toward me with a briefcase in hand. "I'm attorney Mr. Hayes. My client, Mrs. Clara Robinson, has come to discuss an agreement." I set down my shears and stood slowly, brushing the soil off my gloves. "If this is about the court case," I said calmly, "the judge already made her decision." Clara removed her sunglasses, her eyes cold and glassy. "I'm not here for the same case," she hissed. "I came for what's rightfully mine. George promised me shares in the company before he died. You must have hidden the paperwork." I raised an eyebrow. "Hidden them?" "My dear, the only thing hidden here is your shame." Hayes stepped forward, cutting through the tension with a polite cough. "We have reason to believe there's a missing clause in the trust. My client has obtained a witness who claims Mr. Robinson verbally promised a co-ownership agreement shortly before his passing. If we pursue this, it could reopen the case." "A witness." I almost laughed. Clara was spinning her final web. "Who is this mysterious witness?" The lawyer hesitated, glancing at Clara, who crossed her arms and smirked. "Mr. Davis," he said finally. "Your husband's former accountant." Ah, Davis. The man who'd been fired by George for embezzling company funds 5 years ago. So that's who she'd found. "A snake defending a snake?" I smiled softly. "All right," I said, my voice calm but my blood cold. "Come inside. Let's hear your story properly. Inside the living room, I made tea, chamomile for me, nothing for them." I sat down opposite the pair, hands folded neatly. "Now, Mr. Hayes, tell me exactly what this so-called witness claims." He pulled out a paper. "According to Mr. Davis's signed affidavit, your late husband verbally agreed to transfer 25% of the company shares to Mrs. Clara Robinson as a gesture of gratitude for her help managing family affairs." I couldn't help but smile. Gratitude? My husband couldn't even stand to have dinner in the same room with her at the end. Clara's jaw clenched. "You can't prove that." Oh, but I can. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out another envelope, smaller, thinner than the others I'd used before. You see, my husband recorded more than one video. Hayes looked uneasy. Another video? Yes, I said, my tone almost gentle. George left me one for court and another for insurance. I inserted the flash drive into the TV. The screen flickered, and George's face appeared again. The same warm smile, the same steady eyes. Hello again, he began. If this recording is being played, then Clara has found a new way to cause trouble. She's persistent, I'll give her that. But I expected it. Clara's face drained of color. George continued. There is no verbal promise, no missing clause, no transfer of shares. I recorded our last conversation with Mr. Davis, the same day I fired him for theft. If he appears in court again, this recording will speak for itself. The screen switched to security footage. George in his office, talking to a sweaty, nervous man. Davis. You took $30,000 from the account, George said sternly. If I ever hear you falsifying numbers again, I'll press charges. Davis stammered. Sir, please. Clara said. George interrupted him sharply. Clara has nothing to do with my company, and she never will. The video ended. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock. Then I turned off the screen, leaned back and said softly, I suggest you both leave before I forward this recording to the police. It's amazing how the truth has such good timing, isn't it? Hayes, realizing the case was dead, stood up and began gathering his papers. Mrs. Robinson, I believe our business is concluded. Clara glared at him. You can't just walk away. But Hayes only shook his head. You didn't tell me about prior evidence, Mrs. Robinson. I don't risk my license for fantasy. She turned to me, her voice trembling. You think you've won, don't you? I stood, meeting her eyes. No, Clara, I survived. That's what winning looks like when people like you try to bury you. She stormed out, her heels clattering against the hardwood floor. I watched through the window as she climbed into her car and sped away, leaving only the echo of her own downfall behind. That night, Andrew came home with takeout and 2 glasses of wine. She came back, didn't she? He asked quietly. I nodded. For the last time. He smiled sadly. Dad always said you were tougher than the market. I laughed softly. Your father said a lot of things, most of them true. We ate in peace, the rain tapping gently on the window pane. For the first time, the storm didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a cleansing. Before going to bed, I went out to the garden again. The roses were wet, their petals heavy with raindrops, glowing faintly under the porch light. I whispered to the air, It's over now, George. She's gone, and we're safe. For the first time in years, I slept without dreams. The following morning dawned unusually quiet. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving behind the soft smell of wet earth and the glistening shine of dew on the grass. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat on the porch, still in my robe, breathing in the cool air. For the first time in months, the silence wasn't heavy. It was comforting, but peace never comes without echoes. Around mid-morning, Andrew came in from town, holding a folded newspaper in one hand and a stunned expression on his face. Mom, he said slowly, placing the paper in front of me. You should see this. On the front page, in bold letters, was the headline, Local Woman Under Investigation for Fraudulent Property Claims, and just below, Clara's face. My breath caught for a second. The article explained how, after losing the inheritance battle, she'd tried selling shares in George's company to unsuspecting investors, pretending she was the rightful owner. Someone had reported her, and now she was under investigation for fraud, extortion, and forgery. I set the paper down slowly. She did it to herself, I whispered. Andrew sat across from me, rubbing his forehead. She's completely self-destructing. Her greed doesn't have a bottom. No, I said softly, and neither does her loneliness. For a long time, we just sat there in silence. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, painting golden stripes across the table. It felt as if George's spirit was still there, quiet, calm, watching everything unfold exactly as he knew it would. Later that afternoon, I went to the bakery in town for a few groceries. The clerk, Mrs. Henderson, greeted me with a warm smile. "Mrs. Robinson," I saw the paper. "I can't imagine what you've been through, dear." I smiled gently. "It's all right. Time has a way of sorting things out." As I turned to leave, she called after me. "By the way, you got some mail. It came to the shop by mistake. Must have fallen off the delivery truck." She handed me a thick brown envelope. No return address, only my name written in George's old, careful handwriting. My heart stopped. I carried it home with trembling hands. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at it for several minutes before I finally opened it. Inside was a letter, aged, folded neatly, and a single brass key. "My dear Margaret, if you're reading this, it means you've made it past the storm. I always knew you would. I hid this letter where only fate could deliver it at the right time. You see, I kept one final secret from you, not out of mistrust, but out of love. When I learned about my illness, I didn't just write a will. I started a foundation under your name, the Margaret Hope Fund. It's meant to support small business widows, women like you once were, who built something from nothing and were left to defend it alone. The key belongs to a safe deposit box at Greenwood Bank, locker 112. Inside, you'll find the documents. You always said you weren't strong enough, my love, but you were the strongest person I ever knew. I wanted the world to see that strength too. Love always, George." Tears welled in my eyes. I ran my fingers over his signature, feeling the indentation of his pen strokes. He had known. He had planned not only for his family, but for others, to turn our pain into purpose. I took the key and held it tightly. That weekend, Andrew and I went to the bank together. The manager recognized the letter immediately. "Mr. Robinson spoke to us years ago," he said, smiling kindly. "He wanted this to stay sealed until Mrs. Robinson came in herself." Inside the deposit box were several files, a small velvet pouch, and a stack of neatly arranged papers. The documents showed the establishment of the Margaret Hope Fund, fully funded, fully registered. But inside the pouch was something else: George's wedding ring. I hadn't seen it since the day of his funeral. I took it out, tears streaming down my cheeks, and slipped it into my palm. Andrew put his arm around me. "He really never stopped thinking of you, did he?" I shook my head, smiling through the tears. "No, son, not even for a moment." When we got home, I placed the ring beside our wedding photo on the mantel. For the first time, I didn't feel grief. I felt peace. A week later, the local paper ran another story. Fraud charges filed against Clara Robinson. Investigation expands. Apparently, she'd fled the state but was arrested in another city trying to open a new account under a fake name. When Andrew told me, I only sighed. "She'll never stop running from herself," I said. That evening, I sat in the garden, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. The roses swayed in the breeze, their petals glistening like they were whispering George's name. I whispered back, "I kept your promise, love." "And you kept mine." The wind carried the scent of roses through the air, and for the first time in a long, long while, I felt completely at peace. A few months passed, and the days began to blend into a calm, golden rhythm. For the first time in decades, my life wasn't ruled by fear, loss, or the sound of raised voices. The mornings were filled with the smell of coffee and the laughter of customers who stopped by the bakery I'd reopened downtown, the one I named Hope's Corner, in honor of the foundation George had created for me. People came from all over the state just to see it. They said it wasn't just the pastries or the coffee, it was the feeling, the warmth, the sense that whoever stepped inside found a piece of themselves again. Sometimes, when I wiped the counter and looked out through the window, I'd see women sitting together, helping one another fill out grant applications for the foundation. Each one of them had a story like mine, stories of betrayal, survival, and renewal. It felt as though George's plan had stretched far beyond us both, giving second chances to those who'd been forgotten. One afternoon, as I was finishing up the day's orders, a man in his early 60s came in. He looked like someone who'd spent a lifetime on the road. Tan skin, kind eyes, a little tired around the edges. "Mrs. Robinson?" he asked, removing his hat politely. "Yes," I said, smiling. "How can I help you?" "My name's Henry Collins. I used to work with your husband. Years ago, in his early business days, I heard about the foundation and, well, I had something I think you should see. He reached into his briefcase and took out a yellowed envelope. On it, in George's handwriting, were the words, "For Margaret, if Henry ever finds you." My knees almost gave out. I gestured for him to sit, my heart racing. "You worked with George?" Henry nodded. "Back when the company was just a dream on a whiteboard." He was a visionary, but he had enemies. There was someone back then who wanted to destroy him. "I think you deserve to know the full truth." He handed me the letter. My hands shook as I unfolded it. "My dearest Margaret, if Henry is giving you this, it means my fears were right, that someone close to me was trying to undermine everything we built." It wasn't just greed that led Clara down her path. She had help. Years ago, one of my partners, Robert Kane, began moving money secretly through offshore accounts. He made deals that could have bankrupted us. When I confronted him, he threatened me and promised that one day he'd make sure my family paid for my decisions. If anything happens to me, Henry knows where the files are. I never wanted to burden you with this truth, but if my death brings old ghosts to your door, use this information wisely. Protect the foundation, protect Andrew, and above all, protect yourself. All my love always, George. I sat frozen. It felt like George was in the room with me again, warning me from beyond the grave. Henry placed a folder on the table. "Those are the files," he said softly. "Everything George gathered on Kane. After George died, I held on to them in case his fears came true." I flipped through the documents. There were bank statements, offshore transfers, shell companies, and signatures. My stomach dropped when I saw one name repeated across several pages. Robert Kane, current CEO of Mavenco Investments. I knew that name. It had been all over the news last year. The same company that had tried to buy our family's old factory land right after George's funeral. "He's still out there," I whispered. Henry nodded. "And from what I've heard, he's been sniffing around again. Your foundation's success has drawn attention, Margaret. Kane's kind of man doesn't like being reminded of his past." I closed the folder carefully and looked Henry in the eye. "Thank you for bringing this to me. George trusted the right man." He smiled faintly. "He trusted the right woman, too. He used to say you were the heart of everything. When he left, I locked the folder in the office safe. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The idea that someone was still out there, someone who might have had a hand in George's downfall, gnawed at me. The next morning, Andrew came by early. I showed him the letter and the folder. His expression hardened. "Mom, we can't let this slide. If that man's still profiting off what Dad built, people deserve to know." "I know," I said quietly. "But we can't act without proof beyond these documents." "Then we'll get proof," he said firmly. "We'll do it Dad's way, smart and by the book." Over the next few weeks, Andrew worked with a lawyer friend to reopen George's old business accounts and audit any suspicious ties to Mavenco. Meanwhile, I poured my energy into the foundation, organizing events, talking to women who'd lost everything, and making sure every dollar helped someone start again. One afternoon, while reviewing grant applications in my office, my phone buzzed. It was Andrew. "Mom, we found it," he said breathlessly. We traced one of the original accounts. Kane's been laundering money through a dummy charity. "We have everything we need." I sat back, my pulse pounding. "Are you sure?" "Positive. Our lawyer's taking it to the state prosecutor tomorrow." I looked up at the photo of George on my wall, smiling through tears. "You hear that, love? Justice is finally coming for you." That night, as I closed up the bakery, I lit one of George's favorite candles, sandalwood and rose, and whispered, "You didn't die in vain." The next morning, the headline made me drop my coffee. CEO Robert Kane arrested in corporate fraud investigation. Beneath it, evidence linked to whistleblower documents provided by the late George Robinson's family. It was over. For years, I'd carried the weight of George's death like a chain around my heart. But now, that chain had broken. He had not only left a legacy of love, he'd left a map to justice. When I visited his grave that evening, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the stone. I knelt, placing a single rose beside it. "They tried to destroy you, my love," I whispered, "but they only proved how strong we were." And in the hush of the evening, with the wind brushing against the trees. I could almost hear his voice again, calm, proud, and full of peace. You did it, Margaret. You finished the fight. The weeks that followed the arrest of Robert Kane felt like waking from a long nightmare. The story had made national news. Reporters camped outside the bakery, journalists called nonstop, and women from across the country wrote letters thanking me for giving them hope. I had never wanted fame, only peace. But somehow, peace had brought me the kind of recognition I didn't expect. One morning, a man from the local radio station came by. He introduced himself as Caleb Owens, a producer from The Morning Voice, one of the most listened-to talk shows in the state. "Mrs. Robinson," he said with a warm smile, "your story has touched a lot of people. The foundation you're running, it's inspiring. We'd love to have you on air to share your journey." I hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the kind of person who should be on the radio, Mr. Owens," he chuckled. "Ma'am, you're exactly the kind of person people need to hear. Strong, real, human. Andrew insisted I go. Mom, this is what Dad would have wanted. You've turned everything he built into something incredible. People deserve to hear how." So, 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a small studio, the microphone in front of me gleaming under the soft lights. Caleb adjusted the levels and said, "We're live in 5. I took a deep breath, my hands clasped tightly together. He began, "Good morning, everyone. Today we have a special guest, Mrs. Margaret Robinson, founder of the Margaret Hope Fund. Her story is one of loss, strength, and justice. As I spoke, I felt something I hadn't in years, freedom. I talked about George, about the bakery, about the women who'd walked through my doors with broken hearts and left with new dreams." At the end of the show, Caleb smiled and said, "You've become a symbol of resilience. Mrs. Robinson, the nation could use more people like you." I laughed softly. "I'm no symbol, Caleb. I'm just a woman who refused to let pain be the end of her story." The next day, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Newspapers wanted interviews. A morning TV show offered to fly me to New York. The foundation's website crashed from the number of donations pouring in, but one envelope among the day's mail froze me. It was unmarked. Pale gray with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. Typed words, no signature. "You think George was the only one keeping secrets?" My chest tightened. The letter continued. "Meet me at the park bench by Willow Lake, 6 p.m. tomorrow. Come alone, or the world will learn what the Robinson family really did with the money." I reread it 3 times, my heart pounding harder each time. I didn't tell Andrew. I couldn't. That night I barely slept. The old ache of fear had returned, that crawling sense of being watched, of ghosts rising from the past. The next evening, I arrived at Willow Lake just before sunset. The air was heavy, the water still. Families packed up their picnics, children's laughter fading in the distance until I was the only one left. Then, a man stepped out from behind the large oak tree. His gray hair caught the last light of the day, and though I didn't recognize him immediately, something about his posture felt familiar. "Mrs. Robinson," he said, his voice smooth but sharp. "I'm glad you came. Who are you?" I asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "Someone who used to work for your husband. My name's Charles Denton. I was Robert Kane's accountant." I froze. I know about the foundation, about Kane's arrest, and I know George wasn't entirely innocent in those deals. "That's not true," I said firmly. "George risked everything to expose Kane's corruption." Charles chuckled. "Yes, eventually. But before that, he signed off on a few of Kane's shell companies himself. Maybe he didn't know where the money was going at first, but it doesn't matter. The signatures are his, the documents are real, and I have copies." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Unless, of course, the foundation is willing to make it worth my while to forget." I felt a spark of anger rise through the fear. "You're trying to blackmail me." "I'm giving you a chance," he replied coldly. "Pay me and I disappear. If not—" He gestured toward the folder in his hand. "These go public, and your husband's precious reputation dies a second death." The air between us was tense, electric. I looked him dead in the eye and said quietly, "You know what's funny, Mr. Denton? My husband left a few secrets of his own behind, and I know how to use them." He frowned. "What are you talking about?" I took a small recorder from my purse, the same one I had used all those years ago to expose Clara's lies, and pressed play. His entire conversation, his threats, were already recorded. Charles's face went pale. "You made one mistake," I said calmly. "You assumed I'd come here alone, unprepared. But my lawyer's listening to this call right now." In the distance, a pair of headlights appeared. Andrew's car. He stepped out, eyes cold, phone in hand. "The police are on their way, Mr. Denton." The man froze, panic flashing across his face. "You set me up." "No," I said softly. "You set yourself up." The next morning, the front page told the story again. Second arrest in Kane scandal. Former accountant tried to blackmail widow. And once again, George's name was cleared, this time completely. When the chaos died down, I sat on the porch that evening, watching the horizon. The sun dipped behind the trees, turning the sky into shades of amber and gold. Andrew joined me, setting down 2 cups of tea. He smiled. "You handled that perfectly, Mom." I nodded. "I just did what I had to do. For Dad. For all of us." The world had tried to break me again and again, through betrayal, through lies, through fear. But somehow, every wound had made me stronger. The wind rustled the garden leaves softly, and I whispered to the night, "You can rest now, George. Everything's finally right." For the first time in my life, I knew the past was behind me and the future was mine to build. The weeks rolled into months, and slowly everything found its rhythm again. The Margaret Hope Fund was no longer a local effort. It had grown into a national initiative. Women across the country sent letters, donations, and stories of their own resilience. The foundation had become what George always dreamed of, a legacy that outlived both of us. Andrew had moved into the main house to help me manage everything. Sometimes he'd joke, "Mom, you've become a celebrity," and I'd laugh, shaking my head. "No, son, I've just lived long enough to learn what not to let break me." Every morning, I still brewed George's favorite blend of coffee, poured a cup for him, and placed it beside his photo. It was my way of saying, we did it. But one morning, as I sorted through the mail, I came across a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with a gold crest I didn't recognize. It had been sent from Zurich, Switzerland. Inside was a typed letter, formal, cold, but intriguing. "Dear Mrs. Robinson, we are reaching out on behalf of the estate of Mr. George A. Robinson. It has come to our attention that certain offshore assets tied to his name remain unclaimed. These assets are currently under the care of the Zurich Trust Banking Group. Please contact us at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Marcel Duval, Senior Trustee, Zurich Trust Bank." For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. Offshore assets? George had never mentioned any. Everything he left was accounted for. The bakery, the foundation funds, the house. I folded the letter carefully and showed it to Andrew. "Mom, do you think it's real?" I nodded slowly. "It's not a scam." George was careful with money. If this is true, he had a reason to hide it. Within a week, we were on a plane to Switzerland. It was my first trip abroad, something George and I had planned once but never managed. The flight was long, the clouds thick and endless below us, and I couldn't help but feel like I was traveling into a part of George's soul I'd never seen. At the Zurich Trust offices, Mr. Duval greeted us politely. He was a tall man with silver hair and a kind smile. "Mrs. Robinson," he said, shaking my hand, "it's an honor. I've heard much about your foundation. Your husband was a visionary." I smiled faintly. "He was a man of secrets too, it seems," Mr. Duval chuckled. "Aren't all visionaries?" He led us to a quiet conference room and opened a safe deposit drawer. Inside was a thick file and a smaller sealed envelope. "Before he passed," Mr. Duval said, "Mr. Robinson gave instructions that this envelope be opened only in your presence." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, his handwriting again, steady, elegant. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means you've come far enough to uncover what I couldn't tell you before. Years ago, when I began my partnership with Robert Kane, I discovered something dreadful. He wasn't just embezzling funds. He was laundering money through a chain of foreign accounts. I pretended not to know until I could gather proof. But to protect you and Andrew, I created parallel accounts. Not for myself, but for you. in case Cain ever destroyed everything. Those accounts contain every penny I earned cleanly, safely hidden away under your name. I wanted you to find it when you no longer needed the money, but when you needed the truth. Because this was my way of making sure that if I couldn't be there to protect you, my work still would. Live free, my love. Use it to build, to dream, to help others do the same. Always yours, George. By the time I finished reading, my tears had blurred the ink. Andrew squeezed my hand. He really thought of everything. Mr. Duval smiled gently. Your husband left approximately $19 million in assets. They've accrued interest for years. It's now worth nearly 30, I gasped softly. 30 million? Yes, Mrs. Robinson, and every cent is legally yours. I didn't know what to say. My heart raced, not from greed but disbelief. I had spent years fighting just to keep a roof over my head, to save a business, to prove my sanity. And all this time, George's foresight had quietly been waiting across the ocean. That evening, I stood on the balcony of our Zurich hotel, looking out over the snowy Alps. The sky was painted pink and silver, like the world itself was exhaling peace. Andrew came up beside me. So, what will you do with it? I smiled. Exactly what George wanted, build something lasting. When we returned home, the foundation exploded with opportunity. We opened new branches in New York, San Francisco, and London. Women from different countries applied for support. Single mothers, widows, survivors. The fund gave them grants, training, and shelter. The world began calling it the legacy of love. One evening, after the foundation's grand anniversary gala, Andrew said something that melted my heart. Mom, if Dad were here, he'd be speechless. You didn't just survive. You turned pain into power. I looked at him, tears in my eyes. That's all I ever wanted, to make sure his love didn't end with grief. And then, in that quiet moment, I understood something profound. Life doesn't wait for our plans to align. It tests them, breaks them, then rebuilds them into something stronger. George had taught me to love. Pain had taught me to endure. But my own journey had taught me to rise, not as a widow, not as a victim, but as a woman reborn. I took one last sip of champagne that night and whispered softly to the stars, "We did it, George. Together, we built forever." A year later, life had taken on a rhythm so beautiful that even silence felt like a melody. The bakery that once sat at the corner of Willow Street, the same place George and I built from scratch, had been restored and renamed Forever and Flour. It wasn't just a bakery anymore. It was a community kitchen where the women supported by my foundation learned the craft of baking, accounting, and business. Every morning, I would stand behind the counter, the same way I did 40 years ago, and watch new faces, young and old, laughing, working, living. It was everything George had ever wanted. A home, not just for us, but for anyone rebuilding from the ashes. One morning, as I rolled dough on the marble counter, the bell over the door jingled softly. A young woman stepped inside, nervous but determined. She looked no older than 25, holding a small baby wrapped in a pink blanket. "Mrs. Robinson?" she asked softly. I nodded, smiling. "That's me. How can I help you, dear?" She hesitated, then said, "My name is Elena. I'm one of the women your foundation helped. I just wanted to thank you in person. Without the Hope Fund, I'd still be stuck in a shelter with my daughter." My hands froze on the dough. My heart swelled with emotion. "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, walking around the counter to hug her. "You don't owe me thanks. You just owe yourself a good life." She smiled, eyes glistening. "Then I'll start by naming her Margaret." I gasped softly, tears spilling over. That was the moment I truly understood what George meant when he said love should outlive grief. He hadn't left me money. He'd left me purpose. That night, I sat by the fireplace with the old photo album open. George's laugh lines, his big hands covered in flour. Our son Andrew as a baby. All of it still alive in those fading photographs. I placed his wedding ring on top of the photo and whispered, "You won, George. Even in death, you built a world that still gives." Andrew walked in, holding 2 cups of tea. He smiled when he saw me. "Still talking to him?" I laughed. "Always." He sat beside me, glancing at the photos. "Mom," he said after a pause, You know the foundation board wants to name the new branch in your honor, right? They want to call it the Margaret Center for Renewal. I shook my head with a soft laugh. That sounds far too grand for an old baker, Andrew grinned. You're not an old baker. You're the woman who turned a tragedy into a legacy. The fire crackled softly between us, and I leaned back in my chair, watching the flames dance. For the first time in a very long while, I wasn't waiting for peace. I was living in it. A few weeks later, during the first anniversary of the Hope Fund, a young journalist asked me during an interview, "Mrs. Robinson, what would you tell someone who's lost everything?" I thought for a moment, then smiled and said, "I'd tell them loss is never the end. It's the door to a room you never knew existed. Behind it, you'll find your strength, your truth, and sometimes, if you're lucky, your freedom." The story aired that night, and thousands of letters poured in from around the world, women, widowers, sons, daughters, all saying the same thing. Thank you for giving us hope again. As the months passed, I decided to record my story, not for fame, but for the women who might one day sit where I once did, tired, forgotten, and afraid. I called it The Letter George Never Opened, and at the end of that recording, I said, if you ever feel alone, remember, somewhere out there, another woman is lighting her oven, another mother is finding her strength, and another soul is whispering your name in prayer. You're never alone in your fight, because love, in all its forms, always finds a way to rise again. That was the message I wanted the world to remember, that even after betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, there's always something left worth fighting for. Yourself. As I stood in the garden that evening, the roses blooming around me, I felt a gentle breeze brush against my cheek. For a moment I swore I heard George's voice whisper, "See, my love? You didn't need me to stand, you just needed to remember how." I smiled, closing my eyes. "I remembered," I whispered back, and somewhere, in the fading light of dusk, I could almost feel his hand in mine again, steady, warm, eternal.